3 weeks. That was how long Ilara had been telling herself she misheard. 3 weeks of watching Declan smile at Isolde Vane across the great hall, of convincing herself that the low, certain voice she had pressed herself against the council chamber door to overhear had belonged to someone else, that the words had been pulled out of context, that love could survive context. 3 weeks of folding the truth into smaller and smaller shapes until it fit somewhere she did not have to look at it. The night she stopped lying to herself, it was raining. She had gone to return a ledger to the council annex, the kind of errand that required no thought, which was precisely why she had taken it, because thought had become dangerous. The passage that ran behind the old east wall was narrow enough that two people could not pass without turning sideways, and it smelled permanently of tallow and damp stone, and Ilara had always found it easier to breathe there than in any of the grand corridors where her status was visible and incorrect. She was Declan Ashford's intended. She wore it the way one wore a borrowed coat, grateful, uncertain, aware at every moment that it did not quite fit. The voices reached her before she reached the door. She did not press herself against the wall this time. She simply stopped walking, because her feet stopped first, and the rest of her followed. "The formal binding will be arranged before the autumn assembly," Declan's voice said, and it was so familiar, so precisely the voice she had been hearing in her sleep for 2 years, that she almost stepped forward before his next words arrived. "Isolde's bloodline secures the northern claim. The council has agreed she will hold the Luna title." A pause. Someone she did not recognize murmured assent. "What about the Omega?" That voice she did know. Garrett, Declan's second. He sounded the way he always did. Careful, professionally neutral. The voice of a man who had learned to feel nothing about difficult questions. "Ilara will be compensated," Declan said. "She is not without value. We will find her a placement." The ledger was still in her hands when she walked back down the passage. She set it on the floor outside the annex door because she could not think what else to do with it, and then she kept walking, and the rain was coming in through the gap above the eastern courtyard door, and she walked through it without slowing. She did not stop until she reached her room. "She will be compensated. She is not without value." The words had the quality of something that had already been decided before they were spoken. Not cruelty, which would at least have been personal, but administration. Ilara had been an item on a list, and the list had been revised, and she had been moved to a different column. The column marked placement. The dress she had been saving, cream wool with small embroidered flowers along the collar, the one she had thought she might wear to the autumn assembly, was hanging on the back of her wardrobe door. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the drawer beneath the wardrobe and began to pack. She knew better than to take much. She had grown up knowing that. An Omega in the Ashford pack traveled light by necessity, not philosophy, and she had never fully unpacked in the 2 years she had lived in the East Wing as Declan's intended. Some animal part of her, always half ready for the door, that part of her, it turned out, had been right. By the time the great hall clock struck the 4th bell of morning, she was at the tree line. The packlands ended at the river. Beyond it was the wild territory, which was not owned by any pack and not patrolled, and which most wolves avoided because it had a reputation for being both unmappable and indifferent to travelers. The forest there was old growth, dark even in summer, and the paths through it tended to redirect themselves based on criteria no one had ever successfully identified. It was not a place you went to survive. It was a place you went when the alternative was worse. Ilara crossed the river at the shallow ford, where the stones were close enough to step across without wetting more than her boots, and she did not look back. She told herself she was not going to look back. She looked back once, at the pale smear of the pack hall's upper lights through the trees, and then she turned forward and did not look again. The wild territory received her without ceremony. The trees closed around the path, and the rain that had been following her since the east courtyard finally stopped, as though it too had reached a boundary and decided not to cross. The silence that replaced it was not peaceful. It was the silence of a place that had not decided yet what it thought of her. She walked until the cold became something she had to actively manage, rather than simply endure. And then she walked a little further, because stopping felt like a concession to the part of herself that wanted to sit down and make the kind of sounds she had not made yet, the ones that had been building in her chest since the passage outside the council annex. She was not ready for those sounds. They would mean she believed what she had heard, and if she believed it, she would have to decide what she was now, and she did not have an answer for that. What she had instead was a direction, forward, and the particular cold competence that grief sometimes loans a person before the full weight of it lands. She had not eaten since midday. She had water in the small flask she carried in her pack, and she had the wool blanket, and she had the folded packet of dried provisions she kept in the bottom of her bag from habit, the habit of a woman who had never quite trusted that meals would continue to appear. She had her mother's compass, the brass one with the crack along the face that still worked, and she had enough sense to know that walking through unmapped forest in the dark was not survival, it was panic wearing the clothes of action. She found the outcropping by feel more than sight, a shelf of rock that jutted out from the hillside at a slight angle, enough overhang to keep the worst of any returning rain off, and a natural windbreak on two sides. She ate half of what she had allowed herself, drank carefully from the flask, wrapped herself in the blanket, and settled against the rock face with her knees drawn up and her back to the stone. She did not sleep. She had been told, at various points in her life, that she was too quiet, too watchful, too careful with herself, that an Omega who made herself small enough would simply disappear one day, and no one would know which corner she had folded herself into. She had heard these things as criticism, sitting under the rock shelf in the old forest, with everything she owned on her back. She thought there might have been a warning in them she had not known how to receive. Declan had found her charming, once. He had used that word specifically, charming, with the particular emphasis of a man who found the thing surprising. She had been delivering a report from her mother's holdings, a junior envoy role she had taken because it paid, and because it kept her moving, and because movement was the thing she had learned to substitute for safety. He had looked at her across the meeting table, with those amber eyes that the whole pack talked about, and he had said, "You are rather charming, for an Omega," and she had been 23 years old, and grateful, which was the worst possible age and condition for receiving that specific sentence. She had spent 2 years making herself worth keeping. She could see that clearly now, in the cold, without the architecture of hope around it. Every carefully chosen word, every position taken, that reinforced his authority rather than her own instinct. Every morning, she had walked into the great hall and smiled at the right people and eaten the right amount and asked about their children and their border disputes and their harvest yields. She had been composing herself like a document she needed him to sign. The bond she had felt, or thought she had felt, in those first months was real. She did not dispute that. The pull of it had been specific and physical, a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with his title, or his face, or the way the rest of the pack deferred to him. It had been older than all of that, the sensation of arriving somewhere she had been walking toward without knowing it. She had trusted the bond the way you trust gravity, not because you understand it, but because it has never failed to hold you down. She understood now that she had been holding on to something that had not been holding back. The forest breathed around her in the dark. Somewhere above the canopy, clouds moved across the early morning sky, and a thin, cool light began to find its way through the branches. She had been sitting long enough that the cold had settled into her hips and shoulders with the patient permanence of something that intended to stay, and she shifted, pulled the blanket tighter, and tried to think practically. She could not go back. That was not sentiment. It was calculation. She had left without permission, without notifying the pack, which in Ashford territory was technically a challenge to hierarchy, not an act of defiance she had intended, but one the council would read however it suited them. Going back would mean explanations, and explanations would require her to articulate what she had heard, and she was not willing to sit in a council room and watch Declan explain it away in that reasonable, administrative voice, while everyone nodded and agreed that she had misunderstood, that an Omega's interpretation of events was necessarily partial. She could not go back, so she needed to go somewhere. She thought about her mother's cousin in the Western Territory, a woman named Sarah who ran a small herbalist practice and had never married and had opinions about pack hierarchy that she expressed freely and without apparent concern for the consequences. Alara had always found her exhausting. She now found the idea of her something close to necessary. The Western Territory was 4 days on foot, if she could navigate the old forest and pick up the trade road on the other side. She had the compass. She had provisions for 3 days if she was careful. She had the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through every other situation in her life that had required endurance rather than talent. And she had, somewhere under the grief and the cold and the thing in her chest that was going to need to be felt at some point, a growing and entirely unexpected sense of her own edges. She had been compensated, was the thing. The value had been assessed. The placement had been considered. She found that she was angry. The anger was not comfortable. It sat in her chest like a coal that had been there for some time and had only just been given air. But it was useful, and she let it warm her as the light through the canopy shifted from gray to pale gold, and she packed her blanket, shouldered her bag, and stood. She was not going to sit under a rock and wait for someone to come find her. She was also not going to pretend she was fine. She was going to walk, and she was going to feel exactly as angry as she was, and somewhere on the other side of this forest, she was going to figure out what she was made of when no one was watching her be charming. The path she found an hour into the morning's walking was not the one she had been following. The old forest had, as advertised, redirected. She stood at the intersection of 2 narrow tracks and looked at the compass and determined that the new path was running roughly northwest, which was not west, but was at least not deeper in, and she took it, because the alternative was to stand still, and she was done with standing still. She had been following the northwest path for perhaps 2 hours when she smelled the wood smoke. She stopped immediately, the instinct of someone who had spent time in unmapped territory. Smoke meant a fire meant a person. A person in the wild territory was either very capable or very lost, and neither category was automatically safe. She stood at the edge of a small clearing and assessed the air. The smoke was cedar and something earthier underneath, pine resin, a hint of damp wool, a working fire, not a signal fire, someone who was settled in, not signaling. The clearing was small, ringed by old oaks whose roots had buckled the ground into a series of natural walls, and in the center of it, with his back to her, and a knife in his hand, and a stripped rabbit on the flat stone in front of him, was a man she had never seen before. He was large in the way that some wolves were large, not performative bulk, but the kind of density that spoke of a body that had been used extensively and maintained accordingly. His hair was dark and cut without ceremony, and he wore a coat of heavy waxed canvas that had clearly been repaired in several places, and there was absolutely nothing about his posture that suggested he was unaware she was there. "There is a second cup," he said, without turning around. "If you want it." She did not move for a moment. "How long have you known I was here?" "Since the ridge." He nodded to the east, where the path had bent around the outcropping she had stopped at before the clearing. "You walk loudly for someone who is clearly trying not to." She almost said something sharp. She swallowed it and stepped into the clearing instead, because she was cold, and she was hungry, and she had exhausted the part of herself that could afford pride before breakfast. "I am not asking for charity," she said, which she recognized, even as she said it, as the most charitable interpretation of what she was doing, which was walking directly toward the fire. "It is coffee," he said. "Not charity." His name, she learned over the next half hour, was Roan. He offered it the way he offered the coffee, without ceremony, as something practical, a label for purposes of navigation. He did not ask her name until she had drunk half the cup, and the shaking in her hands had stopped, and when she gave it, he received it the same way. Just Roan, just Alara, 2 people in a clearing in the old forest, and the fire between them, and the morning light working its way down through the canopy. He did not ask why she was alone. He did not ask where she was going. He did not look at her the way people looked at an Omega who was obviously somewhere she had not been expected to be, with that particular compound of assessment and condescension that she had spent most of her adult life pretending not to notice. He looked at the fire. He offered her half of the rabbit. She accepted, because she was hungry, and because there was something in the simple transaction of it, food given without theater, received without performance, that made her eyes sting unexpectedly. "The northwest path ends at a ravine," he said. "If you're heading west, you'll need to cut south before the second fork. You know this territory well enough." She studied him sideways while he banked the fire. There was a scar along his jaw, old enough to be silver rather than pink, and his hands were the hands of someone who worked with them regularly. Not rough exactly, but capable looking, the knuckles a little thickened. He moved through the clearing with a kind of economy that was not quite stillness, but was close to it, every motion ending cleanly without unnecessary continuation. She had spent 2 years surrounded by wolves who performed their confidence. This man did not seem to be performing anything. "Are you settled here?" she asked. "In the territory." "Provisionally." He slung his pack and looked at her. His eyes were gray, not the remarkable eyes of a man who knew his eyes were remarkable. Just gray, steady, the color of water over slate. "The western path is faster with two, if you're amenable." She was amenable. She told herself this was pragmatism. They walked through the rest of the morning without the conversation that would have required explanation. And this was the strangest thing about him. Not his competence, which she expected from a man living alone in unmapped forest, but his complete lack of interest in filling silence with language. Most wolves she had known were noise-forward. They talked into spaces, because spaces made them uneasy, because quiet in a pack was either reverence or threat, and neither was comfortable. Roan walked through the quiet, the way he walked through the forest, as though it was simply the medium in which he was moving, with no particular opinion about it. She found herself doing the same, and she found, to her own surprise, that the thing in her chest did not require language after all. It required exactly this: motion, and cold air, and the sound of 2 sets of feet on the forest floor, and the occasional decision made together without negotiation, which fork to take, where to stop and drink, when the light through the trees was saying something worth paying attention to. At midday, they stopped beside a stream, and she refilled her flask, and he sat on a root and ate something from his pack and looked at the water, and she said, "Because it had been building since the morning, I heard something I was not supposed to hear. 3 weeks ago, I believed something else, for 3 weeks, and then I stopped." He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask her what she had heard. He said, "That is a particular kind of tired." It was such a precise description that she had to look away from him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is exactly that." "It lifts," he said, slowly, "but it lifts." She wanted to ask him how he knew. She did not ask. Some knowledges were acquired in specific ways, and she could see from the quality of the way he said it that his had been acquired in a specific way, and that the story attached to it was his to keep or share in his own time. They walked through the afternoon. The old forest began to change around the 3rd hour, the trees thinning slightly, the paths becoming more consistent, the ground firmer underfoot. Alara felt herself beginning to believe that she might actually reach the other side of this, not just the forest, but the larger thing she was in the middle of, and the belief was frightening in proportion to how much she wanted it. "There is a cabin," Roan said, as the light began its afternoon decline. "An hour from here. You're welcome to it tonight, if you need to rest before the trade road." She looked at him. "Whose cabin?" "Mine," he said. "I am there most seasons. It is dry and it has a proper hearth." She thought about it for 4 steps. "All right," she said. The cabin was not what she expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected. Something rough, perhaps. Something functional, in the austere way of a man who had chosen solitude. What she found was a structure that had been cared for with a kind of patient attention that spoke of someone who had been living in it long enough to learn its particular needs. The woodpile was substantial and well covered. The door sat square in its frame. Inside, the hearth was clean and laid with fresh kindling, and the single room had the spare, organized quality of a space where everything had been put exactly where it was most useful. There were books on the shelf beside the hearth. This surprised her enough that she stood looking at them while he built the fire, because there were a great many of them, and they were not the kind of books that were kept for appearances. They had the specific wear of books that had been read more than once. Spines softened, pages marked with strips of folded bark. "You have a great many books for a man in the wilderness," she said. "I have a great many books for most contexts," he said, and she heard something in his voice that might have been amusement, the first trace of it she had encountered. The fire took. The cabin warmed. She sat across from him at the small table and ate the meal he assembled from what turned out to be a surprisingly well-stocked set of provisions, and she felt the day in her body, the miles, the cold, the continuous low-grade effort of being in motion when the easier option was to stop. It was not unpleasant. It was the tiredness of having done something, rather than the tiredness of having endured. "May I ask you something?" she said. He looked up from his cup. "What are you doing here, in the wild territory?" The pause before he answered was not evasive, she thought. It was the pause of someone choosing the most accurate words from among several options. "I needed a period away from certain obligations," he said. "The territory suited me." Obligations to a pack? Another pause. "Among other things." She would have pressed it then, or the old version of her would have, the version trained to gather information and smooth surfaces. The new version, the one that had been walking since before dawn through unmapped forest, found that she was more interested in the quality of the answer than its content. There was nothing evasive in him. He was simply private, the way she had been private for years, keeping the complicated parts behind a door that required permission to open. She recognized it because she had built the same door. "I am not going back," she said, and she was not sure which of them she was telling. "No," he said, simply, without judgment or analysis. "I can see that." She slept that night on the cot he made available to her, with the same matter-of-fact economy as everything else he gave, and she slept without dreaming, which was the first time in 3 weeks that she had managed it. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of him moving quietly in the pre-dawn, and she lay still for a moment and felt the particular texture of waking somewhere she had not been before, the brief disorientation, and then the flooding in of all the reasons why, and then something under all of it, something she had no name for yet, something to do with the smell of the cabin and the quality of the silence and the specific gray of the sky through the small window. She was on her second cup of coffee when she saw the ring. It was sitting on the shelf above the hearth, half hidden behind the base of the oil lamp, and she would not have noticed it if the morning light had not caught it at exactly the right angle. A heavy ring, gold, set with a dark stone, and around the band, she leaned without intending to, drawn by what she was seeing, a symbol she recognized, the Ashford territorial seal, not the pack seal, which was common enough, decorative, the kind of thing young wolves wore on chains, the secondary seal, the seal of the king's hand. She stared at it for a long time. The seal of the king's hand was given to exactly 3 people: the king's appointed mediator in territorial disputes, the head of the royal security force, and the king's own designated successor, the wolf, who would hold authority in the event of the king's absence or incapacitation. She looked at Roan. He was watching her from across the table with the same gray, steady expression she had been reading for a day and a half as simple self-possession, and she saw it now as something else, the practiced composure of a man who was accustomed to being looked at when the looking changed. "The king's hand," she said. He did not deny it. "You are Roan Ashford, not Declan's brother." She would have known him. A cousin, perhaps, or someone in the lateral line. It did not matter. What mattered was the ring, and what the ring meant, and the fact that this man had walked with her through the old forest, and fed her, and offered her shelter, without once indicating that he was anyone other than exactly who he appeared to be. "I have not lied to you," he said, and his voice was different now, not distant, but careful, in a way it had not been careful before, as though he was aware that something had shifted and was not sure yet what it meant. "You did not tell me who you were." "No," he agreed. "I did not." She stood up from the table because she needed to be standing. The anger from yesterday was back, altered, more specific now, and underneath it was something else, something she did not want to examine yet in front of him. "How long have you known who I am?" The pause this time was longer. "I knew your name when you gave it." She had given it the first morning. She had been shaking from cold and sitting next to his fire, and she had said her name as plainly as possible, because there was nothing left in her for pretense, and he had received it quietly and handed her more coffee, and he had known. "Declan's intended," she said. "That is what you knew." "Declan's intended," he confirmed, "and what you had left behind." She turned to face him directly. He met her gaze without flinching, which she had expected. He did not seem like someone who flinched, but there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, something that had been carefully behind that door she had identified the previous evening, and it was visible now because the door was open. "Why?" she asked. "Why not tell me?" "Because you needed someone to walk with," he said, "not someone to recognize you." The words landed with a precision that made her close her eyes for one moment. She thought about the previous day, the clearing and the coffee and the afternoon light on the forest path, and the silence that had not required filling, and the way he had said, "That is a particular kind of tired," as though he already knew. She thought about Declan, who had looked at her across a meeting table and found her charming for an Omega, and who had spent 2 years receiving the document she had been composing herself into, and who had nevertheless decided that what she offered was insufficient for the requirements of the autumn assembly. She thought about the ring on the shelf, and the man who had left it on the shelf instead of wearing it. "You took a season away from your obligations," she said slowly. "That is what you said." "Yes." "Why?" The careful quality in his expression shifted into something more direct. "Because the king's hand is expected to advise on matters of territorial alliance," he said, "including the Ashford binding arrangement. And I could not advise on it honestly without declaring a conflict." She heard the words, and she heard the thing beneath the words, and she stood very still in the morning light of the cabin and let both of them arrive. "A conflict," she repeated. He stood then, slowly, and came around the table, not toward her precisely, but into the space between them, closing some of it without closing all of it, the way you approach something that might be frightened without wanting to frighten it. He was half a head taller than her, and he smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and something underneath that she had been filing under, simply the forest for a day and a half, without examining it more specifically, and now that she was examining it, it was not the forest at all. She knew that scent. She had felt it before, in the 2 years she had been Declan's intended, a ghost of it, at the edges of moments she could not explain, an ache she had attributed to the bond she thought she was building, and now understood, had never been Declan at all. "You were at the autumn assembly 2 years ago," she said. It was not a question. "I was," he said. "I delivered a report from my mother's holdings. At the meeting table." "Yes." "You were in the back of the room." He had been. She had not known who he was. She had delivered her report to the assembled group, and she had felt, once, a sensation she had no word for, like walking through a door and finding the room on the other side was somehow already familiar, and she had looked up from her papers, and she had not found what she was looking for, because she had not known where to look. The bond she had spent 2 years trying to build with Declan had been sitting in the back of the room that whole time, watching her. Her eyes stung again. She refused to let them do more than that. "You said nothing." "You were presented to Declan 3 weeks after that assembly," he said. "Your mother's holding and his northern claim were practical match. By the time He stopped, started again. I had no right to your bond. That is not how it is done. It is exactly how it is done, she said, and her voice was sharp with something she could not entirely separate from grief. The fated bond is not something that requires a right. It is something that exists or does not. Yes, he said, I know that. And you said nothing. And I said nothing, he agreed, and the weight of it in his voice was the weight of someone who has carried a specific thing for a specific time and knows precisely how heavy it is. She turned away from him and looked at the fire because she needed somewhere to put her eyes. That was not his face. The ember at the center of her anger was burning differently now, less like fury and more like the thing that lives under fury when the fury finally lets go of it. She thought about 3 weeks of folding the truth into smaller and smaller shapes. She thought about the passage outside the council annex and the rain and the ledger she had left on the floor. She thought about the first morning in the clearing, shaking with cold, and the cup he had handed her, and the fact that he had known her name and had given her the morning anyway. You came out here to avoid advising on the binding, she said, still looking at the fire. Yes. And when I walked into your clearing, a long silence. I recognized you, he said, immediately. She turned back to him then. The gray eyes were the same as they had always been, steady and careful, but the door was fully open now, and she could see what had been behind it, and it was not complication or politics or the tactical situation of the king's hand in territorial negotiations. It was something much older than any of that. It was the room she had felt through the door 2 years ago at the assembly table. You gave me coffee, she said. You were cold, he said, and you were not ready for anything else yet. She felt the bond between them, the way you feel a current in still water, not visible from the surface, but unmistakably present, the undertow of it, specific and strong. She had thought, for 2 years, that this feeling belonged to something she was building. She understood now that you do not build a fated bond. You simply finally stop standing in a different room from it. She took 1 step toward him. The distance between them was not large, and she crossed half of it, enough that she would have had to reach only a short way to touch him, and she stopped. I do not know what I am now, she said. I left without permission, which makes me technically a challenge to Ashford hierarchy. I have no placement. I have my mother's compass, and 3 days of provisions, and a considerable amount of anger about the last 2 years. I know, he said. I am not going to decide anything today, she said, or tonight, or based on the fact that I have just discovered that what I have been feeling for 2 years was pointing in the wrong direction. I would not ask you to, he said. But I am also not going to pretend I cannot feel it, she said, and there was something relieved in the saying of it. The particular relief of a woman who has been performing not knowing for 2 years and can finally stop. That feels like something I have already done enough of. He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not the satisfaction of a man who had gotten what he wanted. It was the particular expression of someone who has been holding a breath for longer than he should have, and has been given permission to let it out. Your mother's cousin is 4 days west on the trade road, he said. If you are still going that way. I was, she said. I am not certain now. You could stay, he said, and figure out what you are now, without anyone advising you toward a particular answer. She thought about it. She thought about the ledger on the floor of the annex passage, and the word compensated, and the way she had folded the truth into shapes too small to see. She thought about 3 weeks of lying to herself, and 1 day and a half of not lying, and the difference in the weight of the air between those 2 states. She thought about a man who had recognized her name in a clearing, and handed her coffee, and said nothing that required her to be anything, until she was ready. You are not nothing, Alara, he said, and the use of her name in his voice was so different from how it had lived in her own head that she had to take a breath. What they said you were, the placement, and the column, and the valuation, none of that was about you. It was about what they needed from the Northern claim. You are not the Northern claim. She knew this. She had known it since the passage outside the council annex. But there was a specific quality to being told a true thing by someone who has earned the right to tell it, and she felt it land in the exact place where the 3 weeks of folding and the coal of anger and the things she had not been willing to feel had all been living, and it settled there the way heat settles into cold muscle, slow and thorough and relieving. "I am the king's hand's fated mate," she said, and heard how strange it sounded, and then heard how completely, precisely true it was. "Yes," he said, "if you choose to be." The emphasis on those last 4 words was not rhetorical. He meant them with the careful exactness of a man who understood the difference between a bond that exists and a choice that ratifies it, and who was not going to ask her to ratify anything before she was ready. She chose then, not because of the bond, though the bond was there, unmistakable and specific as the undertow of a river she was already standing in. She chose because of the coffee in the clearing, and the afternoon in the forest, and the way he had walked beside her without filling the silence, and because he had kept the ring on the shelf behind the lamp, and introduced himself as just Roan, and because he had known exactly which kind of tired she was, and had not tried to talk her out of it. She chose because she was done being an item in someone else's column, and because the man standing 3 feet from her, in the morning light of a cabin in the wild territory, had never, not once, written her name in one. She crossed the remaining distance between them. She did not close her eyes. She let him see her face, and she saw his, and the bond between them moved from undertow to current, no longer something working beneath the surface, but something acknowledged and above it, flowing between them in the ordinary air of the cabin, like it had always been there, which it had. By the time the spring assembly convened at the Ashford Hall 6 weeks later, the king's hand had returned from his season of leave with a fated mate bond properly witnessed and a formal declaration of conflict of interest filed with the council, removing himself from all advising roles on the Northern Alliance arrangement. The Isolde Vane binding proceeded on its own merits without the king's hand's endorsement, which turned out to be less solid without it, and the autumn assembly was postponed by general agreement. None of this was what Alara had intended when she walked away from the East Wing with everything she owned on her back and her mother's compass in her hand. She stood beside Roan in the assembly hall and felt the pack read her differently than they had ever read her. Not because her status had changed, though it had, but because she was standing differently, taking the space her actual dimensions required instead of the smaller, more provisional version she had been inhabiting. She was still an Omega. That had not changed. She was also the woman who had crossed the wild territory, alone in the dark, and come out the other side, knowing who she was, which turned out to be the only credential that had ever mattered. Roan's hand was warm at the small of her back, not possessive, simply present, the way everything he did was simply present, without performance or theater. She was not charming, for an Omega. She was not charming for any qualifier. She was Alara, and she had been worth choosing all along, and the only thing that had needed to change was the person doing the choosing.